You absolute idiot! Do you know how much this suit costs? The angry voice cut through Le Bernardin's elegant atmosphere like broken glass. The sound of splintering crystal and gasps from nearby diners filled the December air as Alexandra Chen looked up from her business notes, her emerald eyes scanning the five-star restaurant decorated with twinkling Christmas lights and garlands of winter pine. A man in his 50s wearing what was clearly a custom-tailored suit stood towering over a younger man seated at a corner table beneath a massive Christmas tree. Dark red wine dripped from the standing man's jacket like spilled blood staining the expensive fabric, while the seated man, a construction worker by his calloused hands and worn but clean clothes, desperately tried to help with napkins that turned crimson in his fingers. Before we continue, please tell us where in the world you're watching from. We love seeing how far our stories travel. What caught Alexandra's attention wasn't just the confrontation, but the little girl beside the construction worker. She couldn't have been more than 6 years old, with auburn hair pulled into careful braids and wearing a red velvet Christmas dress that had clearly been chosen for this special evening. The child was shrinking back against the leather booth, her small hands pressed over her ears, tears streaming silently down her face as she watched her father being publicly humiliated. "Mommy, that man is being really mean," whispered Sophie, Alexandra's 6-year-old daughter. Sophie sat across from her in their reserved booth, wearing a matching red velvet dress and clutching a small, wrapped present she'd insisted on bringing for good luck to this important dinner. Her blonde hair, so much like Alexandra's own, caught the warm glow of the restaurant's crystal chandeliers as she watched the scene unfold with the kind of moral clarity that only children possessed. Alexandra felt the familiar pang of guilt that seemed to follow her everywhere these days. Here she was dragging her child to yet another business meeting 2 weeks before Christmas because her regular nanny had cancelled at the last minute due to her own family emergency. Sophie shouldn't have to witness adult ugliness, shouldn't have to sit quietly while her mother discussed million-dollar deals with people who saw children as inconvenient interruptions to serious conversation. The scent of garlic and wine, usually comforting in this exclusive restaurant, now seemed cloying as Alexandra watched the confrontation escalate. She recognized that tone in the angry man's voice, the particular brand of entitled rage that came from someone who believed wealth made them superior to everyone else. It was the same voice her father had used when she was a child, the same cutting tone that had taught her early that love was conditional on performance and that mistakes were unforgivable sins. "This is an $8,000 custom suit from Savile Row," the angry man continued, his voice rising with each word as other diners began to stare and whisper. "Do you have any idea what that means to someone like you? More than you make in 3 months, I'd imagine." The construction worker. Connor, Alexandra heard the little girl whisper through her tears, remained standing, his shoulders straight, despite the humiliation. His brown hair was slightly too long, as if haircuts took second priority to more pressing expenses. His hands, as he tried to clean the wine, bore the kind of scars that came from honest physical work, and when he spoke his voice carried the exhausted patience of a man accustomed to fighting battles he couldn't win. "Sir, please, I understand you're upset." My daughter reached for the bread basket and accidentally bumped my arm. It was completely unintentional. "I take full responsibility, and I'll gladly pay for your cleaning costs, even if it takes me time to save up the money." Alexandra watched the little girl, Grace, she remembered Connor calling her, withdraw further into herself with each harsh word from the angry man. The child's lips were moving, but no sound was coming out. She was trying to speak, trying to defend her father or apologize, but the words seemed trapped in her throat by fear and overwhelm. That's when Alexandra noticed something else that made her chest tighten with recognition. Grace wasn't just upset, she was displaying the kind of careful silence that came from trauma, the practiced invisibility of a child who had learned that being seen meant being hurt. "Excuse me," came another voice, and Alexandra's attention snapped back to her own table. Richard Morrison stood beside their booth checking his expensive Rolex with obvious irritation. He was exactly the kind of man her assistant had described when arranging this blind date. Successful, connected, divorced. The perfect potential partner for someone in Alexandra's position during the holiday season, when being single felt particularly stark. "Mr. Morrison," Alexandra said, forcing a smile as she stood to greet him. "Thank you for making time during such a busy season." Richard glanced dismissively toward the corner table, where the confrontation was still unfolding, Christmas ornaments twinkling mockingly overhead. "These places really should screen their clientele more carefully during the holidays," he said, with a sniff of distaste. "That's what happens when restaurants take pity cases during Christmas." The staff probably felt sorry for them. Something cold and familiar settled in Alexandra's stomach, the same feeling she'd had as a child when her father would comment on lesser people who didn't deserve the privileges that came with success. She looked at Richard's perfectly styled silver hair, his confident posture, his expensive watch that probably cost more than most people's Christmas budgets, and realized she was looking at the same kind of man who was currently destroying a father's dignity in front of his traumatized child. As Richard settled himself at their table, making a show of adjusting his cufflinks and smoothing his Italian silk tie, Alexandra found her attention drifting back to the scene across the restaurant. The confrontation was attracting more attention now, other diners pausing their holiday conversations to watch the drama unfold. "I'm sorry, Ms. Chen," Richard was saying, apparently oblivious to the crisis nearby. "I should have mentioned that I prefer business dinners to be conducted without distractions." His gaze flicked meaningfully toward Sophie, who was quietly coloring in a Christmas activity book she'd brought, her small tongue poking out in concentration as she tried to stay within the lines of a reindeer. "Distractions." Alexandra repeated, her voice carefully controlled as she watched Sophie's innocent focus on her artwork. "Children," Richard clarified with a wave of his manicured hand. "Wonderful in their proper place, of course, but business requires focus. Adult focus. I'm sure you understand, given your unique position as a woman in technology. The holidays make everything more complicated, with family obligations interfering with serious discussions." The condescension in his voice was unmistakable, wrapped in the kind of false politeness that made the insult sting deeper. Alexandra had built her company from nothing, while pregnant, had revolutionized 3 different industries, had been featured on the covers of Forbes and Fortune more times than she could count. And yet here was another man suggesting that her success was somehow unique rather than earned, that having a child made her less serious about business. But before she could respond, the confrontation at the corner table reached a crescendo that made several diners gasp audibly. "I don't think you understand the gravity of this situation," the angry man was saying, his voice now loud enough to carry throughout the restaurant and compete with the soft Christmas music playing overhead. "I am Richard Wellington, CEO of Wellington Industries. Do you have any idea who I am? What I could do to someone like you?" Alexandra's blood ran cold as recognition hit her like a physical blow. Richard Wellington. She knew that name from business journals and corporate scandal reports. His reputation for hostile takeovers, union busting, and the kind of ruthless business practices that destroyed families without a second thought. He was exactly the type of person she'd spent her career trying not to become the embodiment of. Everything wrong with unchecked corporate power. Connor remained standing, his weathered hands steady, despite the public humiliation. "Mr. Wellington, I understand you're angry, and I'm truly sorry about your suit. I'll find a way to pay for it, even if it takes me months of extra shifts. But please, my daughter has been through enough trauma. Could we perhaps step outside and discuss this privately?" Wellington's laugh was sharp and cruel, cutting through the warm holiday atmosphere like winter wind. Oh, how noble the laborer wants to protect his little princess. How touching. He turned to address the restaurant at large, his voice dripping with disdain as Christmas lights twinkled ironically overhead. Ladies and gentlemen, this is exactly what's wrong with society today. People who don't belong in places like this. People who can't afford to fix their mistakes, thinking an apology is sufficient when they destroy something valuable. Grace began to cry silently, tears streaming down her face as she watched her father being publicly eviscerated. The sight of the little girl's soundless sobs, her desperate attempt to defend her father through gestures, while her voice remained trapped by trauma, hit Alexandra like lightning. Sophie suddenly stood up from her chair, her Christmas coloring book forgotten, her young voice clear and determined as she addressed the restaurant with 6-year-old moral clarity. "Mommy," Sophie said, her voice carrying surprising authority for such a small person, "that man is being a bully. We learned in school that bullies are people who hurt others because they think it makes them big. But Mrs. Peterson says it just makes them small and mean, especially during Christmas when we're supposed to be kind." The simple truth of her daughter's words, delivered with the kind of innocent wisdom that cuts through adult complications, hit Alexandra like a revelation. Here was her 6-year-old child demonstrating more moral clarity than the supposed adults in the room. Here was Sophie, who'd been raised with every advantage money could provide, recognizing injustice when she saw it, and calling it out without fear or calculation. And here was Alexandra, a woman who'd built an empire on the principle that technology should serve humanity, rather than exploit it, sitting silently, while a father was destroyed in front of his traumatized child 2 weeks before Christmas. The decision formed in her mind with crystal clarity, accompanied by a surge of protective fury she hadn't felt since her own childhood, when she'd watched her father's cruelty destroy weaker people for sport. Alexandra Chen had spent her entire adult life proving that success didn't require sacrificing your principles. She'd built her company on the foundation that innovation should lift people up, not tear them down. She'd fought her way through a male-dominated industry by being better, smarter, and more ethical than her competitors. She wasn't about to abandon those principles now, especially not during the season when kindness was supposed to matter most. "Mr. Morrison," Alexandra said, standing slowly and fixing Richard with a gaze that had made Fortune 500 CEOs reconsider their life choices. "I'm afraid this dinner is concluded. I'm sorry." Richard looked genuinely confused. His attention finally pulled away from his phone, where he'd been checking stock prices during their conversation. "What do you mean, I mean?" Alexandra said, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed, "that I've seen enough to know exactly what kind of man you are. And I don't do business with men who think wealth entitles them to cruelty, especially during Christmas." Before Richard could respond, Alexandra was already moving her red silk dress flowing behind her as she crossed the restaurant toward the corner table where a family's special holiday evening had been destroyed by the selfishness of a man who believed money made him superior to everyone else. The click of her heels against the marble floor seemed to echo through the suddenly quiet restaurant as every conversation stopped. Every diner's attention focused on the unfolding drama. Alexandra could feel dozens of eyes following her. Movement could sense the collective holding of breath as the tech billionaire walked directly into a confrontation that had nothing to do with her business interests. Except it had everything to do with who she was as a human being. It was time to show Richard Wellington what real power looked like. The Christmas lights seemed to dim as Alexandra approached the corner table, her mind flooded with memories she'd spent years trying to suppress. She was 8 years old again, standing in her father's study, with its mahogany paneling and oil paintings of stern ancestors, watching him destroy a housekeeper's Christmas bonus over a minor mistake. "Excellence demands accountability," her father had said, in that same cold tone Wellington was using now. "People of our class don't make excuses for the failures of their inferiors." Charles Chen had been a brilliant businessman who'd built a shipping empire through ruthless calculation and systematic cruelty. He'd taught Alexandra that emotions were weaknesses, that empathy was a luxury she couldn't afford, that success required the ability to step on others without looking back. She'd watched him fire employees days before Christmas, foreclose on family businesses, destroy competitors, not just professionally, but personally, because he enjoyed the power. For years, Alexandra had believed that was simply how the world worked. The strong survived by crushing the weak. And sentiment was for people who couldn't afford to be practical. It wasn't until her divorce 3 years ago that she'd realized how much of her father's poison she'd internalized. David had used her own success against her, painting her as the same kind of cold-hearted monster her father had been. "You chose money over family," he'd said during their final argument. "You're exactly like Charles, brilliant, successful, and completely incapable of human connection." The worst part wasn't that David had said it. The worst part was that for a long time, Alexandra had believed he was right. But watching Connor's quiet dignity in the face of Wellington's abuse, seeing Grace's protective instincts toward her father, despite her obvious trauma, witnessing Sophie's immediate recognition of right and wrong, it reminded Alexandra of who she'd been before her father's training, and her ex-husband's accusations had convinced her that strength and compassion were mutually exclusive. She'd been someone who stood up for others, someone who used her power to protect rather than to harm. Someone who understood that true success meant lifting others up, not tearing them down. Meanwhile, Connor Blake stood frozen in the spotlight of unwanted attention, his mind calculating costs he couldn't afford, while his heart broke watching his daughter's silent tears. The wine stain on Wellington's jacket represented more than embarrassment. It represented the destruction of everything Connor had saved for months to afford. 26 months ago, Connor had been a different man entirely. He'd been married to Sarah, the most loving woman he'd ever known, raising Grace in a warm home filled with laughter and music, and the easy chaos of family life. Sarah had been a nurse at Seattle Children's Hospital, the kind of person who brought injured animals home and insisted they keep them until they healed. Grace had inherited her mother's gentle spirit, her instinct to nurture anything broken. Then came the routine gallbladder surgery that was supposed to be simple outpatient home the same day. Connor had kissed Sarah goodbye that Tuesday morning, had promised to pick up Grace from her grandmother's house and have dinner waiting when Sarah got home. Instead, he'd gotten a phone call that shattered his world into pieces so small he was still finding fragments in unexpected moments. Complications during surgery, the doctor had explained, with the kind of clinical detachment that medical professionals used to distance themselves from tragedy. Unexpected bleeding from a nicked artery. "We did everything we could, but the damage was too extensive." Sarah had died on that operating table victim of what the hospital's investigation later called a cascade of preventable errors. A tired resident who'd been working 18 hours straight, outdated equipment that should have been replaced years earlier, a communication breakdown between surgical teams that cost precious minutes during the emergency. The wrongful death settlement had been substantial $2.8 million that felt like blood money compensation that could never replace Sarah's laugh, or her terrible cooking attempts, or her ability to make Grace giggle until her sides hurt. The money was supposed to provide security to ensure Grace's future, to ease the practical burdens of single parenthood. Instead, it had become a source of constant anxiety. Connor lived in fear of spending it frivolously, of somehow dishonoring Sarah's memory by using her death benefit for anything less than essential. Every expense was carefully calculated, every purchase weighed against the knowledge that this money was all Grace would ever have from her mother. The worst part wasn't the financial pressure, it was watching what his grief had done to Grace. For the first 6 months after Sarah's death, Grace had been typical mourning child. She'd asked difficult questions about heaven, and angels had cried herself to sleep some nights. But she'd still been Grace, creative, curious, full of the chatter that made Sarah laugh, and call her My little magpie. Then had come the evening Connor received the final legal papers officially closing Sarah's case. He'd thought Grace was at her art therapy session, had thought he could allow himself one private moment to grieve the finality of it all. He'd sat at their kitchen table and read the settlement documents that reduced his wife's life to a dollar amount, and something inside him had completely broken. Grace had come home early and found him collapsed over those papers, sobbing with the kind of raw, ugly grief that sounded like an animal in pain. The sight of her strong, capable father completely shattered had traumatized Grace in ways Connor was still trying to understand and undo. From that day forward, Grace had stopped speaking, except in whispers so quiet most people couldn't hear them. The therapists called it selective mutism, triggered by complex trauma. Grace could speak physically, but had retreated so far inside herself that words felt dangerous. She communicated through drawings now, through gestures, through the kind of silent language that only Connor had learned to interpret fluently. Tonight's dinner was supposed to be a celebration. Grace had won first place in her school's holiday art contest, a watercolor painting of a family of snow angels that had impressed the judges enough to earn a $50 prize and recognition in the school newsletter. It was the first time Grace had participated in any kind of public activity since Sarah's death, the first sign that she was beginning to engage with the world again. Connor had wanted to mark the occasion somehow to show Grace that her talents were worth celebrating. He'd used a favor owed by Jimmy Martinez, one of his crew, who had a cousin working at Le Bernardin, to get a reservation at a restaurant far beyond their normal budget. Grace had picked out her favorite Christmas dress, had carefully placed her art contest ribbon in her small purse, had even managed a shy smile when Connor told her they were going somewhere fancy for dinner. The irony was crushing. Connor made good money as a construction foreman, $85,000 a year, supervising road crews for the Department of Transportation. But $8,000 for a suit represented nearly 6 weeks of take-home pay after taxes. It was 4 months of Grace's specialized therapy sessions with Dr. Martinez, the only therapist who'd made real progress with her selective mutism. It was the emergency fund he'd built up for medical expenses or job injuries, the buffer that let him sleep at night knowing Grace would be provided for no matter what happened. More devastating than the money was the shame. The knowledge that everyone in this restaurant would remember the clumsy laborer who'd ruined an important man's expensive clothes. The fear that Grace would internalize this humiliation and retreat even further into her protective silence. Daddy Grace whispered, her small hand slipping into his. Her voice so quiet he had to strain to hear it over the restaurant's background noise. I'm sorry. It's my fault for reaching for the bread. No, sweetheart? Connor said, kneeling beside her chair and speaking in the gentle tone he'd perfected over months of coaxing words from his traumatized daughter. This isn't your fault. Accidents happen to everyone. We'll figure this out together, just like we always do. But even as he said the words, Connor wasn't sure how they would figure this out. Wellington was clearly the kind of man who would pursue this issue beyond the restaurant, who might even use his corporate connections to make Connor's life difficult. Construction was a surprisingly small industry word traveled fast about workers who caused trouble, and Connor couldn't afford to be labeled as problematic or unreliable. Look at this touching scene. Wellington continued, his voice cutting through Connor's internal calculations like a blade. The poor single father trying to comfort his little princess. Very heartwarming. But sentimentality doesn't pay for destroyed property, does it? Connor felt his temper flare for the first time since the incident began. Not at the attack on him, which he'd endured, but at the mocking tone Wellington used when referring to Grace. His daughter had already survived more trauma than most adults would face in a lifetime. She didn't deserve to be used as a prop in this man's power play. Sir Connor said, standing to his full height and looking Wellington directly in the eye, "You can speak to me however you choose. I made a mistake, and I'll pay for the consequences. But please don't involve my daughter in your anger. She's 6 years old, and she's already survived losing her mother in a medical accident. She doesn't need to endure your cruelty too." Wellington's eyes glittered with malicious interest rather than sympathy. "Medical accident? How convenient. Let me guess, you're one of those people who sue hospitals for routine complications who turn tragedy into profit." The accusation hit Connor like a physical blow. The settlement money that kept him awake at night with guilt and responsibility that he protected so carefully for Grace's future was being twisted into evidence of greed. "My wife died due to medical malpractice during routine surgery," Connor said quietly, his voice steady despite the rage building in his chest. "The settlement was acknowledgement that preventable errors cost my daughter her mother. But that's not relevant to tonight's accident. Isn't it, though?" Wellington smiled with the satisfaction of someone who'd found a weakness to exploit. A man accustomed to turning accidents into paydays suddenly finds himself on the other side of liability. "I wonder what a judge would think about your history of profiting from misfortune." The threat was clear, and Connor felt the last of his composure beginning to crack. This man wasn't just demanding payment for his suit, he was threatening to destroy Connor's reputation, to paint him as some kind of opportunistic fraud who exploited tragedies for money. That's when Grace stood up. Connor watched in amazement as his daughter, who hadn't spoken above a whisper in public for over a year, slowly rose from her chair and walked around the table to stand beside him. She looked up at Wellington with the kind of direct, fearless gaze that reminded Connor heartbreakingly of Sarah. "My daddy didn't want the money," Grace said, her voice quiet but clear enough for nearby tables to hear. "He cried when the lawyers gave it to us. He said money couldn't bring Mommy back, but he had to take it for me, because that's what Mommy would want." The restaurant went completely silent. Wellington stared down at Grace with surprise, clearly not having expected the traumatized child to speak, let alone to defend her father with such devastating honesty. "He works extra jobs, so he doesn't have to spend Mommy's money." Grace continued, her small voice growing stronger with each word. "He said the money is for my college, and emergencies, not for making mistakes, go away. And he never wanted to be here tonight, but I won an art contest, and he wanted to celebrate with me, because Mommy would have wanted that too." Connor felt tears burning behind his eyes as he watched his daughter find her voice in defense of their family's honor. This was the most Grace had spoken in public since Sarah's death, and she was using that breakthrough to protect him from a bully's lies. Grace Connor whispered, kneeling beside her, and speaking just loud enough for Wellington to hear, "You don't have to defend me, sweetheart. Sometimes bullies say mean things when they're upset." "I know," Grace said, looking directly at Wellington with a wisdom that seemed far too old for her 6 years. "But Mommy always said that when people are hurting others, someone has to speak up for what's right, even if it's scary." That's when the voice cut through the air like a blade wrapped in silk. "Excuse me, gentlemen." I couldn't help but notice this conversation. Connor turned to see a woman approaching their table with the kind of presence that made rooms go quiet and conversations pause. She was stunning, blonde hair swept up in an elegant chignon, wearing a red dress that managed to be both professional and striking, moving with the confidence of someone accustomed to being the most powerful person in any room. But what caught Connor's attention wasn't her obvious wealth or undeniable beauty. It was her eyes. They were fixed on Wellington with the kind of cold fury that suggested this conversation was about to take a very different turn. Behind her, trailing at a respectful distance, was a little girl about Grace's age wearing a matching red Christmas dress and watching the unfolding scene with obvious concern. Connor had no idea who this woman was or why she was inserting herself into their situation. But something about the way she positioned herself slightly between Wellington and Grace, something about the protective stance she took, despite having no obligation to get involved, made Connor think that perhaps their terrible evening was about to become something else entirely. Wellington, for his part, seemed equally surprised by the interruption. His angry expression shifted to one of calculation as he took in the woman's obvious wealth and status. "I'm sorry, miss, but this is a private matter between myself and this gentleman," Wellington said, his tone becoming more polite, but no less condescending as he tried to assess whether this newcomer was worth impressing or dismissing. The woman smiled, and Connor felt a chill of anticipation run down his spine. He'd seen smiles like that before, usually right before someone very powerful made a decision that changed everything for everyone else in the room. "Oh, but I think you're wrong about that, Mr. Wellington," she said, her voice pleasant but carrying an undertone of steel that made Connor's pulse quicken. "This stopped being a private matter the moment you decided to publicly humiliate a father and traumatize a child during Christmas season." Wellington's eyes narrowed as he tried to place her, clearly recognizing that he was dealing with someone significant, but unable to immediately identify the threat she represented. "And you are?" Wellington demanded with the kind of imperious tone he'd probably used successfully for decades. "Someone who's about to do something unbelievable," the woman replied, and Connor found himself holding his breath waiting to see what would happen next as Christmas lights twinkled overhead and his daughter's small hand slipped into his, trusting him to keep her safe, no matter what came next. "I'm Alexandra Chen, CEO of Chen Technologies," the woman said, her voice carrying the quiet authority of someone accustomed to being recognized and obeyed. The Christmas lights overhead seemed to highlight her blonde hair like a halo, but there was nothing angelic about the protective fury building in her emerald eyes. Connor felt his breath catch. Alexandra Chen. Everyone who read business magazines knew that name. She'd revolutionized cloud computing architecture, had built one of the most successful companies in Silicon Valley from her garage, while pregnant was regularly featured in Forbes as one of the most powerful women in America. And she was standing in Le Bernardin 2 weeks before Christmas defending him and Grace against one of the most connected men in corporate America. Wellington's demeanor shifted immediately as recognition dawned. Connor watched the calculation flicker across the older man's face like a neon sign, the potential for either valuable networking or dangerous opposition. The careful weighing of risks and benefits that defined every interaction for men like him. Ms. Chen Wellington said, his tone becoming oily with false charm as he straightened his wine-stained jacket. "What an unexpected pleasure during this festive season. I'm Richard Wellington, CEO of Wellington Industries. Perhaps you've heard of our recent acquisition of Meridian Shipping. We're expanding our footprint significantly in the new year. I've heard of your reputation," Alexandra interrupted, her voice cutting through Wellington's practiced pitch like winter wind through Christmas tinsel. "And right now, I'm watching you live up to it in the worst possible way." The restaurant had gone completely silent except for the soft, instrumental version of Silent Night playing from hidden speakers. Every diner, every waiter, every busboy had stopped what they were doing to watch this confrontation between 3 of the most powerful people in American business unfold over spilled wine and wounded pride. Sophie moved closer to her mother, slipping her small hand into Alexandra's free one, with the instinctive gesture of a child recognizing that something important was happening. Connor noticed the way Alexandra automatically adjusted her stance to protect both children, positioning herself as a physical barrier between Wellington and the girls. Grace had pressed herself against Connor's side, but she wasn't cowering anymore. She was watching Alexandra with fascination, her artist's eye taking in details, the way the woman's red dress caught the light, how her voice remained steady, despite obvious anger, the protective way she'd included Grace in her defensive positioning without even thinking about it. Ms. Chen Wellington continued, apparently still hoping to salvage the situation and possibly gain a valuable business connection in the process. "I'm sure someone of your stature understands the importance of maintaining standards, especially during the holiday season. When people dress inappropriately for establishments like this, when they behave carelessly around their betters, there have to be consequences. Society depends on proper order." They're betters. Alexandra repeated, her voice dangerously quiet, as Christmas ornaments sparkled mockingly overhead. Mr. Wellington, are you suggesting that your net worth determines your moral worth, that having money makes you inherently superior to other human beings? Connor watched, fascinated, despite his anxiety, as Alexandra positioned herself even more deliberately between Wellington and Grace. She wasn't just defending them with words, she was physically placing herself as a barrier between the aggressor and the most vulnerable person in the room, treating Grace with the same protective instinct she showed toward her own daughter. I'm suggesting, Wellington said, his composure beginning to crack under Alexandra's steady gaze, that actions have consequences. This man ruined an $8,000 suit through his carelessness and his child's lack of proper supervision. I expect appropriate compensation for the damage, plus the cost of my time, and the embarrassment of being assaulted in a public establishment. Assaulted, Alexandra's voice rose slightly, and Connor heard the dangerous edge that had probably terrified corporate boardrooms across the nation. Mr. Wellington, are you actually claiming that a 6-year-old child reaching for bread at dinner constitutes assault? I'm stating facts. Wellington replied stiffly, his face flushing red in the warm glow of the restaurant's holiday lighting. The child bumped her father's arm. Wine spilled onto my clothing. My property was damaged. These are not opinions, they are verifiable facts that will hold up in any court. Alexandra looked at Wellington for a long moment, and Connor saw something shift in her expression. The controlled anger was still there, but underneath it was something deeper, a kind of moral certainty that suggested this conversation was about to reach its conclusion in a way Wellington hadn't anticipated. You're absolutely right, Alexandra said finally, her voice calm in a way that made Connor's pulse quicken with anticipation. Those are facts. Here's another fact. You're a grown man who chose to verbally assault a father and terrorize a 6-year-old child over an accident that could have happened to anyone in this restaurant. She opened her elegant clutch a handbag that probably cost more than Connor's monthly salary and pulled out a leather checkbook that looked like it came from a private bank. Another fact, Alexandra continued as she began writing with smooth, confident strokes, is that this restaurant is equipped with security cameras that have recorded every moment of your behavior tonight. Every word you've said, every threat you've made, every instance of you using your perceived status to bully someone you consider beneath you. Wellington's face was beginning to flush with anger, but Connor noticed a flicker of uncertainty creeping into his expression as other diners began pulling out their phones, clearly recording this confrontation for social media. Ms. Chen, Wellington said, his voice taking on a warning tone. I don't know what you think you're accomplishing, but I have significant influence in this city. You don't want to make an enemy of me over some misguided sense of holiday charity. I'm not making an enemy, Alexandra said calmly, tearing the check from her book with a crisp sound that somehow managed to cut through all other noise in the restaurant. I'm revealing one. Mr. Blake, your name is Connor Blake, correct? Connor nodded, still too stunned by the surreal nature of the situation to form coherent words. Mr. Blake has offered to pay for your dry cleaning, which is the appropriate response to an accidental spill. Alexandra continued, folding the check with precise movements. However, since you've chosen to escalate this situation into public humiliation and verbal abuse, particularly targeting a child who recently lost her mother, I'm going to handle this differently. She extended the folded check toward Wellington, but didn't release it immediately when he reached for it. This check is for $20,000, Alexandra said, her words causing audible gasps from nearby tables. It will more than cover the cost of your suit and any associated expenses you care to claim. Wellington's eyes widened with surprise and greed, his business instincts temporarily overriding his anger. But Alexandra's next words wiped the satisfaction from his face. However, she continued, there are non-negotiable conditions attached to this payment. Conditions. Wellington's voice was wary now, the first hint that he was beginning to understand. he'd miscalculated the power dynamics of this situation. First, Alexandra said, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to having her terms accepted. "Without question, you will immediately apologize to Mr. Blake for your inappropriate behavior. A genuine apology that acknowledges your misconduct, not a legal disclaimer designed to protect you from liability." Wellington's jaw worked silently as Connor watched the internal battle play out, the man's pride warring with his recognition of who Alexandra was and what her enmity could cost him in business circles. Second, Alexandra continued without waiting for a response. "You will apologize to Grace for frightening her and for suggesting that a child could be responsible for your adult reactions to an innocent accident." Grace looked up at the mention of her name, her eyes wide with surprise that this powerful stranger was demanding an apology on her behalf. And third, Alexandra said, her voice taking on the tone Connor recognized from the few tech conferences he'd attended, the voice of someone announcing a decision that would change everything. "You will leave this restaurant immediately. You will not contact Mr. Blake or his daughter again. You will not use your business connections to retaliate against him in any way. If you violate any of these conditions, I will personally ensure that every major business publication in America receives a detailed account of your behavior tonight, along with the security footage I mentioned and the social media videos being recorded right now." The silence in the restaurant was deafening. Connor could hear his own heartbeat, could feel Grace's small hand clutching his shirt as she watched the adults around her navigate this tense moment. Somewhere behind him, he was dimly aware of other diners shifting in their seats, of cell phone cameras recording every moment of this confrontation for posterity. Wellington looked at the check in Alexandra's hand, then at her implacable face, then at the dozens of witnesses surrounding them. Connor watched the calculation happening in real time, the cost of his pride versus the potential price of making an enemy of one of the most powerful people in American business, especially with video evidence of his behavior spreading across social media. The Christmas music seemed to mock the tension in the air as Wellington struggled with his decision. "I apologize to Mr. Blake for my reaction to the accident," Wellington said stiffly, the words clearly tasting bitter in his mouth as Christmas bells jingled softly in the background. And to Grace, Alexandra prompted, her voice gentle but implacable. Wellington's gaze flicked down to Grace, who was still pressed against Connor's side, but watching the proceedings with alert intelligence. For just a moment, Connor thought he saw something almost human in the older man's expression. A flicker of recognition that he'd been terrorizing a child who'd already survived more trauma than most adults would face. "I apologize to you as well, young lady," Wellington said quietly, his voice losing some of its earlier arrogance. "You did nothing wrong. I was upset about my clothing and took my frustration out on you and your father inappropriately." Grace nodded solemnly, accepting the apology with the same grave dignity that had characterized her defense of Connor earlier. Alexandra released the check, and Wellington took it with hands that Connor noticed were shaking slightly. The man who'd seemed so powerful and threatening just minutes earlier now looked smaller, somehow diminished by having his cruelty exposed in public. "Our business here is concluded," Alexandra said with finality. "I trust you can find your way to the exit without further disrupting other families' holiday celebrations." Wellington looked like he wanted to say something else, perhaps to reassert his authority or make some face-saving gesture, but the weight of dozens of stares and the presence of recording devices apparently convinced him that discretion was the better part of valor. He turned and walked toward the restaurant's entrance, his expensive shoes clicking against the marble with sharp, angry sounds that seemed to fade as he passed under the mistletoe hanging in the doorway. As soon as Wellington disappeared through the front doors, the restaurant erupted in conversation and scattered applause from nearby tables. Connor heard excited whispers as diners discussed what they'd just witnessed, caught fragments of praise for Alexandra's intervention and condemnation of Wellington's behavior. But all of that faded into background noise as Alexandra turned to face him and Grace directly for the first time. "Mr. Blake." she said, her voice gentler now, but still carrying that undertone of authority that suggested she was accustomed to solving problems decisively. I hope you'll accept my apologies for how you've been treated tonight. That kind of behavior is unacceptable anywhere, but especially during Christmas season when we're supposed to be celebrating kindness and generosity. Connor found his voice at last, though it came out rougher with emotion than he'd intended. Ms. Chen. I thank you. I don't know what to say. You didn't have to intervene, especially not at the risk of making a powerful enemy. Yes, I did, Alexandra said firmly, her green eyes meeting his with startling directness. When you see injustice happening, especially to a child, you have a choice. You can walk away and pretend it's not your problem, or you can stand up for what's right. I chose to stand up. Sophie, who had been silent throughout the confrontation, suddenly stepped forward with the fearless directness that only children possessed. My mummy said your little girl was sad because someone was being mean, she said to Connor, her young face serious with concern. I think your little girl is very brave for talking to that scary man. Grace looked at Sophie with surprise, and something that might have been the beginning of a smile, the first genuine expression of happiness Connor had seen from his daughter all evening. Sophie's absolutely right, Alexandra said, kneeling down to Grace's level with practiced ease, bringing herself to the child's eye level. You handled that very scary situation with remarkable courage, Grace. You stood up for your father when it would have been easier to stay quiet. Your mother would be very proud of you. She is brave, Connor said, his voice thick with emotion as he looked down at his daughter. Grace is the bravest person I know. She's been through more than most adults could handle, and she faces every day with more courage than I could ever manage. Alexandra stood smoothing her red dress as she did so, the Christmas lights catching the silk fabric and making it shimmer like holiday magic. Mr. Blake, she said, her tone becoming more personal, less formal. I realize this evening hasn't gone the way you planned. Would you and Grace be interested in joining Sophie and me for dessert? I think we could all use something sweet after that unpleasantness, and it seems a shame for our daughters to be separated when they're clearly interested in getting to know each other. Connor looked at Grace, who was staring at Sophie with fascination. The two girls were almost exactly the same size, both wearing red Christmas dresses that made them look like they could be sisters, both with the kind of serious expression that suggested they were processing the adult drama they'd just witnessed with remarkable maturity. I'd like that very much, Connor said, meaning it more than he'd meant anything in months. If you're certain we wouldn't be imposing on your evening. You wouldn't be imposing? Alexandra said, her smile becoming warm and genuine for the first time since Connor had met her. You'd be helping me prove a point to my daughter. What point? Connor asked, curious, despite everything that had just happened. Alexandra's smile widened as she gestured toward their daughters, who were now shyly showing each other their small holiday accessories, Sophie's sparkly hair clips and Grace's art contest ribbon. That the best way to end a terrible experience is to replace it with a good one, and that the holidays are about finding family in unexpected places. As they settled at Alexandra's larger table, the waitstaff quickly rearranging place settings and bringing fresh linens, Connor couldn't help but marvel at the surreal nature of the situation. An hour ago, he'd been a construction foreman, taking his traumatized daughter to dinner, hoping to celebrate her small victory in art class. Now he was sharing holiday dessert with one of the most powerful women in America, watching their daughters bond over chocolate cake and animated discussions about favorite Christmas movies. But more than that, he was watching Grace smile. Really smile for the first time in months, her eyes bright with interest, as Sophie told her about the Christmas pageant at her school and asked Grace about her winning artwork. And watching Alexandra Chen, billionaire, CEO, tech innovator, one of the most successful people in the world, patiently answer Sophie's questions about why adults sometimes acted badly during Christmas, and explaining the importance of standing up for others, Connor began to suspect that this evening might have changed more than just Grace's mood. It might have changed everything about what family could look like. Saturday morning sunlight streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Alexandra's penthouse, illuminating fresh pine garlands and the massive Christmas tree that dominated her living room. She sat in her home office ostensibly reviewing quarterly reports, but her mind kept drifting to chocolate cake and the way Grace Blake's eyes had lit up when Sophie had shared her crayons 3 days ago during their impromptu dessert celebration. It had been 1 week since the incident at Le Bernardin, and Alexandra found herself thinking about Connor's quiet strength, the way he'd maintained his dignity while protecting Grace from witnessing adult cruelty. There was something about his combination of gentleness and resilience that lingered in her thoughts like a melody she couldn't quite place, accompanied by the memory of Grace's brave defense of her father and the breakthrough of her speaking clearly for the first time in months. "Mummy, can we go to the Christmas market today?" Sophie's voice interrupted her thoughts. Her daughter appeared in the office doorway, still wearing her reindeer pajamas, but carrying the small sketchpad she'd been inseparable from since meeting Grace, now filled with drawings of 2 little girls playing together under Christmas trees. Alexandra glanced at her schedule. 3 video conferences with international clients, a board call about next quarter's product launch, and a mountain of contracts to review before the holiday break. A typical Saturday in the life of a CEO who'd never learned to separate work from life even during Christmas season. But instead of explaining to Sophie why work had to come first, why the holiday market would have to wait until she'd handled her responsibilities, Alexandra found herself closing her laptop with a decisive snap. "You know what?" "That sounds perfect," Alexandra said, surprised by her own words, but feeling lighter already. "Give me 20 minutes to get ready, and we'll make a whole day of it." Sophie's squeal of delight was infectious, and Alexandra felt something loosen in her chest that had been tight for years. When was the last time she'd spontaneously decided to spend time with her daughter? When was the last time she'd chosen Sophie over her schedule, especially during the busy pre-holiday period, when quarterly reports demanded attention? An hour later, they were walking through the Union Square holiday market. Sophie chattering excitedly about the hot chocolate stand she wanted to try and the handmade ornaments she hoped to find for their tree. Alexandra wore jeans and a cashmere sweater, clothes that felt foreign after years of power suits and designer dresses, but somehow right for this moment of being just a mother with her daughter rather than a CEO with obligations. "Mommy, look!" Sophie suddenly exclaimed, pointing toward a booth selling hand-carved wooden toys. "It's Grace and Connor." Alexandra followed her daughter's gaze and felt her heart skip in a way that had nothing to do with business stress. They're examining a display of wooden puzzles with careful attention were Connor and Grace. Connor wore a thick wool coat that had seen better years but was clean and well-maintained, while Grace had on a bright red coat that made her auburn hair shine like copper in the winter sunlight. They were sharing a bag of roasted chestnuts, both of them studying the intricate carvings with the kind of focused appreciation that spoke of people who understood craftsmanship. The scene was peaceful domestic in a way that made Alexandra's chest tighten with an emotion she couldn't quite name. Father and daughter comfortable in each other's silence, sharing a simple Saturday morning without agenda or schedule, finding joy in small discoveries and shared experiences. "Can we say hi?" Sophie asked already, tugging on Alexandra's hand with the irrepressible energy of a child who'd found a friend. Before Alexandra could answer, Grace looked up from examining a wooden horse and spotted them. The little girl's face broke into a shy smile that transformed her entire expression, and she tugged on Connor's sleeve, pointing in their direction with obvious excitement. Connor's expression when he saw them was a mixture of surprise and something that looked genuinely pleased, and Alexandra felt warmth spread through her stomach like hot chocolate on a cold day. "What a wonderful coincidence," Connor said, as they approached, his breath making small clouds in the crisp air, as he greeted them with the kind of old-fashioned courtesy that seemed increasingly rare in Alexandra's world of power lunches and strategic networking. "Sophie, Grace has been hoping to see you again. She's been drawing pictures of you all week." Grace nodded enthusiastically and pulled out a small sketchbook from her coat pocket, showing a drawing of two little girls holding hands while ice skating with adults watching from benches nearby. Even in crayon, it was clear that one figure was meant to be a woman in a red coat. "She drew you," Connor said to Alexandra, his voice soft with emotion as he watched his daughter communicate through her art. "And she's been asking if we might run into you during our Saturday adventures. I think you made quite an impression the other night." "She made quite an impression on me too," Alexandra replied, meaning it more than she'd expected. Looking at Grace's hopeful expression at the way the little girl clutched her sketchbook like a treasure, Alexandra felt something shift in her chest. "Grace, that's beautiful. You're incredibly talented. Have you been drawing for a long time?" Grace nodded and flipped to another page, this one showing a family of 4 people decorating a Christmas tree together, their faces bright with crayon-colored joy. Grace has been in art therapy since Connor paused, glancing at his daughter with careful consideration, since she started having trouble with words after her mother died. Dr. Martinez says drawing helps her express feelings that are too big for talking. "That's very wise," Alexandra said, kneeling down to Grace's level so they could look at the drawings together. "Art can say things that words sometimes can't. I used to draw when I was your age, too, especially when grown-ups around me were being difficult." Grace's eyes widened with interest, and she quickly flipped to a blank page, beginning to sketch something new with focused concentration. "Can Grace come look at the ornaments with me?" Sophie asked, practically bouncing with excitement as she pointed toward a nearby booth displaying handmade glass decorations that caught the winter sunlight like captured rainbows. "Of course," Connor said, but Alexandra noticed the way he positioned himself, where he could keep both girls in sight, the protective awareness of a single parent who'd learned to be vigilant about his daughter's safety. As the girls explored the booth together, Sophie chattering about her favorite colors, while Grace listened with attentive silence, Alexandra found herself studying Connor more closely. In the harsh lighting of the restaurant, she'd been focused on the confrontation on Wellington's cruelty and her own need to intervene. But here in the soft winter light, surrounded by the festive atmosphere of the holiday market, she could see details she'd missed. Connor Blake was perhaps 34, with the kind of lean strength that came from physical work rather than expensive gym memberships. His hands, as he helped Grace button her coat against the December chill, were scarred and calloused but unmistakably gentle. His hair needed a trim, as if haircuts took second priority to more pressing concerns. And when he looked at Grace, his entire face transformed with love and protectiveness that made Alexandra's throat tight with recognition. "I hope you don't mind us intruding on your Saturday," Alexandra said, watching Sophie show Grace how to hold a delicate glass icicle ornament up to the light to see the patterns inside. Sophie insisted on coming to the market, and when she saw Grace, "You're not intruding at all," Connor said quickly, his smile genuine and warm. "To be honest, it's nice to have company. Grace and I spend a lot of time just the two of us, especially on weekends. Sometimes I worry she's too isolated from other children." There was something in his tone that made Alexandra study his face more carefully. She recognized the expression, the guilt that came with feeling like you weren't giving your child everything they needed, the weight of being a single parent who had to be everything to someone else. "How long has it been, just you and Grace?" Alexandra asked gently, though she suspected she knew the answer from their earlier conversation. 26 months next week," Connor said, his voice carefully neutral in the way people used when discussing tragedies they'd learned to carry without breaking down. Her mother died when Grace was 4. Complications during what should have been routine surgery at Seattle Children's Hospital. The simple statement hit Alexandra like a physical blow. She looked at Grace, who was patiently showing Sophie how to make the glass ornament spin and catch the light, and felt her heart break for this little girl who'd lost her mother so young and then watched her father's grief traumatize them both. "I'm so sorry," Alexandra said, meaning it with every fiber of her being. That must have been incredibly difficult, especially dealing with Grace's response to the loss. Connor was quiet for a moment, watching Grace laugh silently at something Sophie had whispered to her, the sound of her joy carrying across the busy market like music. "The hardest part wasn't the grief, though, that nearly destroyed me." Connor admitted his honesty, surprising Alexandra with its raw vulnerability. "The hardest part was watching Grace retreat into herself afterward. She used to be such a chatty kid, always asking questions, always telling elaborate stories about her imaginary adventures. Now she barely speaks above a whisper, and only when she absolutely has to." Alexandra watched the interaction between the two girls, noting the way Grace communicated through gestures and expressions, how Sophie seemed to instinctively understand and respond without needing verbal cues, creating a space where Grace felt safe to express herself. "But she's comfortable with Sophie," Alexandra observed. "I can see her relaxing, engaging more than she probably does with most children." "She is," Connor agreed, and there was wonder in his voice as he watched his daughter point excitedly at different ornaments, while Sophie nodded enthusiastically at each selection. "Grace hasn't warmed up to anyone this quickly since before Sarah died. Usually it takes her months to feel safe with new people, even other children. But with Sophie, it was immediate. Like they recognized something in each other. They stood in companionable silence for a while, watching their daughters explore the market stalls together. Sophie's confident chatter balanced perfectly by Grace's attentive listening. Alexandra found herself relaxing in a way she hadn't in years. There was something about Connor's presence that was simultaneously calming and energizing. He didn't need her to perform or impress or prove anything. He was content to simply exist in this moment, sharing this experience without agenda or expectation. "Can I ask you something?" Connor said, eventually, his breath making small clouds as vendors called out holiday greetings around them. "Of course. What made you intervene the other night? I mean, really. You could have just ignored what was happening, finished your dinner with your business associate, gone on with your evening. But you didn't. You put yourself in the middle of a situation that had nothing to do with your business interests, potentially made a dangerous enemy. Why risk that?" Alexandra considered the question carefully, thinking about her father's lessons in emotional detachment, about her ex-husband's accusations of coldness, about the years she'd spent questioning her own capacity for human connection. "Because I've been that child," she said. Finally, watching Grace carefully examine a wooden angel ornament with the focused intensity of an artist studying a masterpiece. "Not in Grace's exact situation, but I know what it feels like to be powerless while adults use their authority to hurt you. I know what it's like to have no one stand up for you when you can't stand up for yourself." Connor looked at her with surprise, clearly not having expected such a personal revelation. "Really, I would have thought someone in your position. You'd think money and success would protect you from that kind of treatment." Alexandra smiled ruefully, pulling her cashmere scarf tighter against the December wind. "In some ways, it's the opposite. When you're successful, especially as a woman, people assume you must have sacrificed your humanity to get there. They assume you're cold, calculating, incapable of genuine empathy. And after a while, you start to believe it yourself." She paused, watching Sophie carefully break a piece of hot pretzel into small pieces so Grace could share it, the simple gesture of childhood generosity, making her chest feel tight with emotion. "My father was a lot like Wellington, brilliant businessman, completely ruthless when it came to anyone he considered beneath him. He taught me that emotions were weaknesses, that empathy was a luxury I couldn't afford if I wanted to be successful. My ex-husband spent our entire divorce telling everyone that I'd chosen money over love, that I was incapable of being a real mother or wife because I was too focused on building my company." But Connor prompted gently, his attention completely focused on her words rather than the bustling market around them. But watching Wellington attack you and Grace, seeing the way you protected her while still maintaining your dignity, it reminded me that strength and compassion aren't opposites. You can be powerful and gentle. You can be successful and human. Alexandra met Connor's gaze directly. You showed me something I'd forgotten about myself. Connor was quiet for a moment, processing her words while they watched their daughters share hot chocolate from a vendor's cart. Grace's shy smile growing brighter as Sophie insisted she try the whipped cream mustache game. You know, Connor said finally, I've spent the last 2 years feeling like I was failing Grace in every possible way. Like I wasn't enough to be both her mother and father, like I couldn't give her what she needed to heal from losing Sarah and then watching me break down. But seeing her with Sophie, watching her smile and laugh and engage with someone new, maybe I've been too focused on what I couldn't give her instead of recognizing what I was already providing. The girls had finished their hot chocolate and were now sitting cross-legged on a bench, heads bent over Grace's sketchbook, as they collaborated on some artistic project that involved intense, whispered consultation and frequent giggling. They're good for each other, Alexandra observed, feeling something warm and unfamiliar spreading through her chest as she watched the two children create their own world of shared imagination. They are, Connor agreed. Grace needs someone who doesn't treat her like she's broken, who doesn't speak to her in whispers like she's made of glass. Someone who just accepts her exactly as she is. And Sophie needs someone who listens without judgment. Alexandra finished understanding more about her own daughter in this moment than she had in months of expensive consultations with child psychologists. Someone who understands that children have their own wisdom, their own way of seeing the world that adults often dismiss. They looked at each other, and Alexandra felt something pass between them. Recognition, understanding the beginning of something that felt dangerously close to the kind of connection she'd convinced herself she was incapable of forming. Connor, she said impulsively, the words coming out before she could second-guess them. Would you and Grace like to come to dinner next Friday? Nothing fancy, just Sophie and me at home. Grace could show Sophie her room, they could work on art projects together, maybe watch a Christmas movie. Connor's smile was genuine and warm, transforming his entire face in a way that made Alexandra's pulse quicken unexpectedly. We'd love that, he said. But fair warning, once Grace gets comfortable somewhere, she might never want to leave. She's already drawn 3 pictures of your house based entirely on Sophie's descriptions. That's perfectly fine with me, Alexandra said, meaning it more than she'd expected. Our house could use more laughter and creativity. It's been too quiet for too long. As they gathered their things and prepared to leave the market, Sophie ran up to Alexandra with her arms full of packages and her face bright with excitement. Mommy Grace and I picked out presents for each other, and Connor helped me find the perfect ornament for our tree. It's a little girl and boy, holding hands under a star just like me and Grace. Alexandra looked at the delicate glass ornament Sophie held carefully in her mitten-covered hands, at the hope and joy on her daughter's face, and felt something shift permanently in her chest. I think that's the most beautiful ornament we've ever had, Alexandra said, accepting the decoration with the reverence it deserved. As they said their goodbyes and went their separate ways, Alexandra found herself looking back over her shoulder to watch Connor and Grace walking hand in hand toward the subway station. Grace's sketchbook tucked safely under her arm, and her face still bright with the residual joy of an afternoon spent with a friend. There was something about the sight of them, the gentle giant of a man, and the tiny girl who trusted him completely, that made Alexandra's chest feel tight with possibilities she wasn't quite ready to name. But for the first time in 3 years, Alexandra Chen found herself thinking less about quarterly reports and board meetings, and more about what it might feel like to build something that couldn't be measured in dollars or stock prices. Something that felt remarkably like hope, wrapped in Christmas lights and the laughter of children who'd found each other exactly when they needed to. 3 months had passed since that first encounter at Le Bernardin, and Alexandra's life had settled into a rhythm she'd never expected to crave. Friday dinners had become sacred. Connor and Grace would arrive at her penthouse at 6, and the four of them would cook together, eat together, and spend the evening in a bubble of domestic contentment that felt like the life Alexandra had always secretly wanted, but never thought she deserved. Grace had begun to blossom under the combined attention of Connor, Alexandra, and Sophie. She still spoke softly, still preferred drawing to verbal communication in stressful situations, but she laughed more easily, smiled more frequently, and had even begun to whisper secrets to Sophie during their elaborate games of dress-up and collaborative art projects that covered Alexandra's refrigerator with colorful proof of their friendship. Connor had become something Alexandra couldn't quite define. Not quite a boyfriend in the traditional sense, not exactly just a friend, but something deeper and more complicated than either label could contain. They talked for hours about everything and nothing, shared stories about their children and their fears and their dreams, supported each other through the daily challenges of single parenthood. He'd begun staying later on Friday nights, helping with Sophie's bedtime routine, lingering over coffee. While they discussed books and current events and the small details that make up a meaningful life, Alexandra's work hadn't suffered. If anything, she'd become more efficient, more focused, knowing that her evenings and weekends were reserved for something that felt more important than another board meeting or contract negotiation. Her assistant had commented that she seemed happier. Her employees had noted that she was less likely to demand impossible deadlines, and her board of directors had actually complimented her on what they called her improved executive presence. Everything felt perfect, which should have been Alexandra's first warning that something was about to go catastrophically wrong. The call came on a Tuesday morning in March while Alexandra was reviewing first-quarter projections and thinking about Connor's suggestion that they take the girls to see the cherry blossoms in Washington, D.C. over spring break. Her assistant buzzed in with unusual urgency, her voice tight with concern. "Ms. Chen, I have David Harrison on line 1. He says it's urgent and concerns Sophie." Alexandra's blood turned to ice water in her veins. David Harrison, her ex-husband, hadn't contacted her directly in over 18 months, communicating only through lawyers when absolutely necessary regarding child support modifications or custody schedule adjustments. For him to call personally, especially claiming urgency about Sophie, meant something was seriously and immediately wrong. David, Alexandra said, accepting the call with carefully controlled calm while her heart hammered against her ribs. "What's going on? Is Sophie hurt?" "Alexandra." David's voice was smooth and professional, the tone he'd always used when he was about to deliver devastating news with surgical precision. "Sophie is fine physically. I'm calling because I'm deeply concerned about her emotional and psychological welfare." "Sophie's welfare?" Alexandra repeated, her protective instincts immediately flaring to maximum alert. "What are you talking about? Sophie is perfectly healthy and happy." "Is she, though?" David's voice carried that familiar note of condescension that had once made Alexandra question her own sanity. "Because I've been receiving some very disturbing reports about her living situation, about the kind of people you've been exposing her to, about choices you've been making that put our daughter's safety and development at risk." Alexandra felt her stomach drop toward her shoes as the familiar patterns of David's psychological warfare began to crystallize. "What kind of reports?" "Reports that you've been essentially cohabitating with some construction worker and his mentally damaged child. Reports that you've been introducing Sophie to people of questionable background and character without proper vetting or consideration for her well-being. Reports that suggest you're prioritizing your own romantic needs over your responsibilities as a mother." The accusations hit Alexandra like physical blows, each one designed to target her deepest insecurities about her capacity to be a good parent while maintaining her career. She could hear the implied threat in David's voice, could sense him building towards something that would change everything. David. I don't know who's been feeding you information, but Connor is a good man who, Alexandra, I'm not here to argue with you about your taste in men. David interrupted with the kind of dismissive tone that had once made her feel like a foolish child. I'm here to inform you that I'm filing for primary custody of Sophie, effective immediately. The words seemed to echo in Alexandra's office as if spoken in a cathedral. Primary custody. David wanted to take Sophie away from her completely and permanently. You can't be serious. Alexandra managed her voice barely above a whisper as the implications crashed over her like a tsunami. I'm completely serious. I have documentation showing that you've been exercising profoundly poor judgment in the people you allow around our daughter. I have witnesses who can testify that you've been prioritizing a romantic relationship over your responsibilities as a mother. I have evidence that suggests Sophie is being exposed to potentially dangerous individuals with documented histories of workplace violence and confrontational behavior. Workplace violence. Alexandra's voice rose despite her efforts to stay calm. David, what are you talking about? Connor has never. Your construction worker friend has been involved in multiple workplace incidents over the past 2 years, has a documented history of confrontational behavior in public establishments. There's evidence of a physical altercation at an upscale restaurant just 4 months ago, where he was involved in property destruction and verbal assault. Alexandra realized with growing horror that David was referring to the incident with Wellington at Le Bernardin. Somehow he'd gotten access to security footage or witness reports and was twisting Connor's moment of being victimized into evidence of dangerous behavior. The wine spill that had led to Connor being publicly humiliated was being reframed as Connor being the aggressor. David, that's completely out of context, and you know it. Connor was the victim in that situation, not the aggressor. He was being verbally abused, and I intervened too. That's your interpretation of events. David said, with the smooth confidence of a man who'd built his legal career on manipulating facts to serve his narrative. A family court judge might see it very differently when presented with evidence of how this relationship has affected your judgment as a mother. When shown documentation of how you've allowed this man and his traumatized non-verbal child to essentially move into Sophie's home environment. Alexandra closed her eyes, trying to process what was happening. David hadn't shown meaningful interest in having Sophie for anything beyond his court-mandated alternate weekends in over 2 years, hadn't attended a single school event or parent conference, and now he was threatening to take her daughter away entirely. What do you want? David Alexandra asked, though she already suspected she knew the answer. I want what's best for Sophie. I want her in a stable environment with a parent who isn't constantly distracted by work obligations and inappropriate relationships. I want her to have a normal childhood with normal role models, not whatever dysfunction you're creating with this inappropriate chosen family situation. The subtext was crystal clear. David wanted control. He wanted to punish Alexandra for moving on, for finding happiness, for building a life that didn't include being perpetually apologetic for her success or ashamed of her ambition. This wasn't about Sophie's welfare, it was about David's need to reassert dominance over the woman who'd dared to thrive without him. I'll fight you on this with every resource at my disposal, Alexandra said quietly, steel threading through her voice. Sophie belongs with me. She's happy, healthy, thriving in every measurable way. You can certainly try to fight, David, replied, and she could practically hear his satisfied smile through the phone. But ask yourself this question. Alexandra, is your relationship with this man really worth risking Sophie's future? Because that's exactly what you're doing. You're gambling our daughter's psychological well-being on some romantic fantasy with someone completely unsuitable for your social position. Connor is not. Think carefully about your next words, David interrupted, because everything you say will be documented and presented to the court as evidence of your priorities and judgment. I'm offering you one opportunity to end this relationship voluntarily and focus entirely on being the mother Sophie deserves. Or you can choose this man over your daughter and deal with the consequences. After David hung up, Alexandra sat in her office chair for nearly an hour, staring out at the Manhattan skyline and trying to process what had just happened. Everything she'd built, everything she'd fought for, everything that mattered to her was suddenly at risk because she'd dared to open her heart to someone who made her laugh and supported her dreams. That evening, Connor arrived for their usual Friday dinner to find Alexandra in her kitchen mechanically chopping vegetables with the kind of precise violence that suggested barely controlled emotion. The usual warmth and anticipation she felt when hearing his key in the door had been replaced by a churning anxiety that made her feel physically sick. "Hey, Connor," said softly, immediately sensing something was catastrophically wrong. "Where's Sophie and Grace?" "Sophie is having dinner with Mrs. Patterson tonight," Alexandra said, without looking up from her cutting board where she was reducing carrots to uniform pieces with unnecessary aggression. "I asked her to take Sophie for the evening, and I thought maybe Grace should stay home tonight, too." Connor set down the flowers he'd brought, simple daisies from the corner market, that Sophie loved to arrange in mason jars, and moved closer. His construction worker's instincts clearly picking up on the dangerous tension radiating from Alexandra's rigid posture. "Alexandra, talk to me. What's wrong? Did something happen at work?" The gentleness in his voice was almost her undoing. Alexandra set down her knife with exaggerated care and gripped the edge of the granite counter, trying to find words for what she had to say for the choice she was being forced to make. "Connor, we need to have a serious conversation. About us, about where this relationship is heading, about whether we're making responsible choices for our children." Connor's face went very still, and Alexandra could see him processing the formal tone she'd adopted, the careful distance she was trying to create between them. "Okay," he said carefully. "What brought this on? Because 4 hours ago you were texting me about Sophie's excitement for tonight's dinner, and now you're talking like you're about to break up with me. David called today. My ex-husband. He's filing for primary custody of Sophie." Alexandra watched Connor absorb this information, saw the way his expression shifted from confusion to concern to something that looked disturbingly like resignation. "I see," Connor said quietly, "and he's using our relationship as grounds for this custody challenge. He's claiming that I'm exercising poor judgment, that I'm exposing Sophie to potentially dangerous people, that I'm prioritizing my romantic life over my responsibilities as a mother." The words tasted like ash in her mouth. "He has documentation about the incident at Le Bernardin that makes you look like the aggressor rather than the victim." Connor was quiet for a long moment, and Alexandra could see him working through the implications with the same methodical problem-solving approach he probably used on construction sites. "Alexandra," Connor said finally, his voice carefully controlled, "tell me what you're thinking right now, because I can see you pulling away from me, building walls, and I need to understand what decision you're making." Alexandra felt tears burning behind her eyes, but she forced herself to continue. "I'm thinking that maybe David has a point. Maybe I am being selfish. Maybe I am putting Sophie at risk by bringing you and Grace into our lives. Maybe I'm asking too much to want both professional success and personal happiness." Do you really believe that Connor asked, stepping closer, despite the obvious barriers Alexandra was trying to erect? The question hung between them like a challenge. Alexandra looked at this man who'd helped Sophie with her science projects, who'd taught her daughter to appreciate different kinds of music, who'd held Alexandra while she cried about a particularly brutal board meeting, and never once suggested she was being too emotional or demanding. "No," she whispered, the admission tearing at her throat. "I don't believe that. But it doesn't matter what I believe. It matters what a family court judge will believe when David presents his case with the help of expensive attorneys and private investigators. Connor moved even closer, his hands gentle as he turned her to face him. Alexandra, what are you saying? Are you ending this? Are you choosing David's threats over what we've built together? I'm choosing Sophie. Alexandra said the words, feeling like they were ripping something essential out of her chest. I'm choosing my daughter's security over my own happiness, because that's what mothers do. That's what being a parent means, making sacrifices even when they destroy you. And what about what Sophie wants? What about what makes her happy? Connor's voice was rising now, frustration and pain making him less careful with his words. What about the fact that she lights up every time she sees Grace and me? What about how much she's grown and thrived since we became part of your lives? Sophie is 6 years old, Alexandra said, forcing her voice to remain steady, even as her heart shattered into pieces. She doesn't understand the complexities of custody law or the potential consequences of having more people in her life who love her. Connor interrupted his professional calm, finally cracking under the weight of what was happening. The potential consequences of seeing her mother happy and supported. The potential consequences of having Grace as a sister. Figure who adores her. Alexandra flinched at the word sister, but pressed on knowing that if she didn't finish this conversation now, she'd never have the strength to do what needed to be done. Connor, you don't understand the kind of man David is. He's wealthy, connected, absolutely ruthless when he wants something. He'll use every resource at his disposal to paint me as an unfit mother. He'll drag our relationship through the mud, make you look like some kind of predator who targeted me for my money. He'll destroy your reputation, probably cost you your job, and he'll do it all while claiming to protect Sophie's best interests. Stop! Connor's voice was quiet but firm, and something in his tone made Alexandra look at him directly for the first time since he'd arrived. Just stop! Alexandra saw the hurt in his eyes, the way her words had landed like physical blows, the careful distance he was already beginning to create to protect himself from further damage. You know what the saddest part of this is? Connor said, his voice soft, but carrying an edge that made Alexandra's chest ache. It's not that you're scared of losing Sophie. Any parent would be terrified of that. It's that you're so willing to believe David's version of who I am, who we are together. That's not. Isn't it? Connor challenged. You're standing here telling me that our relationship is inappropriate, that I'm somehow dangerous for Sophie's well-being, that what we've built together is selfish and wrong. You're repeating every cruel thing David has said about us like they might actually be true. Alexandra felt something cracking in her chest, the careful walls she'd built around her heart beginning to crumble under the weight of what she was destroying. Connor, please understand. Sophie is everything to me. I can't lose her. I won't lose her. And I would never ask you to risk losing her. Connor said quietly, his voice heavy with resignation and heartbreak. But I am asking you to fight for her. For us. For what we could be as a family, instead of letting David's threats drive you back into the isolated, defensive life you were living before. We're not a family. Alexandra said the words feeling like poison on her tongue, but necessary to get out. We're two people who got carried away, who forgot that sometimes wanting something isn't enough to make it work. Connor stared at her for a long moment, and Alexandra watched something fundamental die in his eyes. I see, he said finally. He said, well, I guess there's nothing more to say, is there? He turned toward the door, then paused, his hand on the handle. For what it's worth, Alexandra, I think you're making a mistake. Not just about us, but about Sophie. You're teaching her that love is something to be sacrificed when it becomes inconvenient. You're showing her that fear is more powerful than hope, that other people's threats matter more than your own heart. Connor's voice was quiet but certain. And you're teaching her that the people who love you will eventually abandon her when things get difficult. Because that's what you're doing to Grace and me right now. Abandoning us the moment loving us requires courage instead of just happiness." After he left, Alexandra collapsed onto her kitchen floor and cried until she had no tears left, until her chest felt hollow and scraped raw. Outside, spring rain began to fall against the windows, washing the city clean, while Alexandra's world felt like it was ending. She'd made her choice. She'd chosen safety over love, security over happiness, fear over hope. The only question now was whether she'd made the right decision or destroyed the best thing that had ever happened to any of them. 6 weeks after Alexandra had destroyed her relationship with Connor to save Sophie's custody, the family court hearing arrived like an execution date she'd been dreading since childhood. She sat in the austere conference room, wearing her most conservative navy suit, her hair pulled back severely, every detail of her appearance calculated to project maternal competence and moral authority, while her heart felt like it had been replaced with broken glass. Across the mahogany table, David Harrison looked exactly like the successful corporate attorney he'd always been. Expensive charcoal suit, confident posture, the kind of practiced charm that made juries trust him and opponents underestimate him. His attorney, Margaret Fisk, was legendary for her ruthless efficiency in custody cases and her ability to destroy opposing parents' credibility with surgical precision. Sophie sat beside Alexandra, small and solemn, in her best dress, occasionally drawing in her coloring book, but mainly watching the adults with the kind of serious attention that suggested she understood far more than anyone wanted her to. Ms. Chen Margaret Fisk began her voice, carrying the authority of someone accustomed to controlling courtrooms. "You've certainly built an impressive business empire. Billionaire CEO, technology innovator, clearly capable of providing material advantages. But financial success doesn't automatically translate to effective parenting, does it?" Alexandra kept her voice steady, despite the fear clawing at her throat. "I believe I've been an excellent mother to Sophie. She's healthy, happy, excelling academically and socially. But your priorities have become conflicted recently, haven't they? You've been spending significant time and emotional energy pursuing romantic relationships rather than focusing on Sophie's developmental needs." Here came the attack Alexandra had been preparing for since David's threatening phone call. "I've maintained appropriate boundaries while ensuring Sophie receives excellent care and attention." Margaret Fisk smiled with predatory satisfaction. "Let's examine your relationship with Connor Blake. You became romantically involved with Mr. Blake approximately 6 months ago, correct? We developed a friendship that involved him and his daughter spending multiple nights per week in your home, creating a quasi-family situation without proper consideration for Sophie's psychological adjustment or Mr. Blake's suitability as a parental figure." Alexandra felt her jaw clench. "Connor is a good man who cares deeply about both our daughters. Chen, did you conduct comprehensive background checks on Mr. Blake before allowing him unrestricted access to your daughter? The trap was perfectly laid. No but. So you had no way of knowing about Mr. Blake's pattern of workplace incidents, his involvement in public altercations, his documented history of confrontational behavior. Before Alexandra could respond, Margaret Fisk was already activating the courtroom's display screen, showing heavily edited security footage from Le Bernardin that made Connor appear aggressive and Alexandra look naive. This footage shows Mr. Blake involved in property destruction and verbal confrontation in an upscale restaurant, requiring intervention from other patrons. Is this the kind of role model you want for Sophie? Alexandra's heart sank as she watched their story being twisted into something unrecognizable. Every moment of Connor's dignity was edited out, every instance of his being victimized, reframed as evidence of instability. "Your Honor." Alexandra's attorney attempted to object. "This footage is deliberately misleading. The footage speaks for itself." Margaret Fisk interrupted smoothly. "Mr. Blake's behavior pattern combined with Ms. Chen's failure to properly vet his character demonstrates a profound lack of judgment regarding Sophie's safety. David leaned back in his chair, satisfaction written across his face. This was proceeding exactly as he'd orchestrated. That's when the conference room door opened. "I apologize for the interruption, Your Honor, but I have critical evidence relevant to this case." Alexandra turned to see Linda Morrison, a woman she didn't recognize, professional-looking, carrying a briefcase, moving with the confidence of someone who belonged in legal proceedings. "And you are?" Judge Patterson asked. "Linda Morrison, licensed private investigator. I represent concerned parties who have relevant testimony regarding the character assassination being attempted here today." David's expression shifted from satisfaction to confusion, then growing alarm. This wasn't part of his carefully orchestrated narrative. "Your Honor," Margaret Fisk protested, "we weren't notified of any additional testimony because you were too busy cherry-picking evidence to support a predetermined conclusion," Linda said, calmly opening her briefcase. "I have the complete unedited security footage from Le Bernardin showing the actual sequence of events." She distributed tablets to both legal teams and the judge, each displaying crystal-clear footage of Wellington's abuse, Connor's patient dignity, Grace's traumatized silence, and Alexandra's intervention. "What you've seen today was selectively edited to reverse victim and aggressor," Linda explained. "The complete footage shows Mr. Blake being verbally assaulted and threatened by Richard Wellington, a man with his own documented history of corporate bullying and hostile business practices." Alexandra felt a flutter of hope as she watched Margaret Fisk's confidence begin to crack. Furthermore, Linda continued, "I have testimony statements from 15 of Mr. Blake's co-workers, all describing him as protective, reliable, and consistently professional. The workplace incidents referenced in Mr. Harrison's filing were occasions when Mr. Blake prevented accidents or protected younger workers from safety violations." David was looking increasingly uncomfortable as his narrative crumbled in real time. "I also have statements from Sophie's teacher pediatrician and 3 child psychologists who have observed her development since Connor and Grace became part of her life. All report marked improvement in Sophie's confidence, social engagement, and emotional well-being." Linda turned toward the judge with professional authority. "Finally, Your Honor, I have someone who insisted on testifying personally." She gestured toward the door, and Connor entered with Grace beside him. Grace carried a large portfolio of artwork, her small face serious but determined. Alexandra's breath caught. She hadn't seen Connor in 6 weeks, not since their devastating breakup in her kitchen. He looked tired, older somehow, but his presence filled the room with quiet strength. "Grace Blake, age 6, would like to address the court through her artwork," Linda announced. Grace walked to the center of the room and opened her portfolio, revealing dozens of drawings. She selected the first one, a picture of 4 people holding hands in front of a house with sunshine and flowers everywhere. "I drew this after our first dinner together," Grace said, her voice soft but clear enough for everyone to hear. "I hadn't talked much since my mommy died, but Sophie made me feel safe. And Alexandra was kind to my daddy when someone was being mean to him." She showed the next drawing, Connor teaching Sophie to ride a bicycle while Alexandra and Grace watched from a park bench. This is when Connor taught Sophie to ride without training wheels. Sophie was scared, but Daddy was patient like he always is. He never gets mad when teaching is hard. Another drawing appeared, all 4 of them baking cookies in a kitchen, flour everywhere, everyone laughing. "This is when we made cookies and made a big mess, and Alexandra said, 'Messes are worth it when you make them with people you love.'" Grace looked directly at David with the fearless honesty only children possess. "I know Sophie's first daddy wants to take her away from us, but Sophie is happy with our family. We take care of each other. That's what real families do." Sophie suddenly stood up from her chair. "I want to say something too," Sophie announced, her 6-year-old voice carrying surprising authority. Judge Patterson nodded. "Go ahead, Sophie. My first daddy thinks Connor is bad for me. But Connor taught me how to be brave. He taught me that being strong means helping people, not hurting them. Grace is my best friend, and Connor makes my mummy smile in a way she never used to. Sophie looked at David with devastating directness. You left us because you said Mommy cared more about work than family. But Mommy worked hard so I could have good things. And now she found someone who thinks her working hard is good, not bad. Someone who helps instead of making her feel wrong. Judge Patterson listened to the children with the attention their words deserved. After a long silence, she spoke. In 25 years on this bench, I've learned that children often see truth more clearly than adults. Mr. Harrison. While your concern for Sophie is noted, the evidence suggests Ms. Chen has provided excellent care and that Mr. Blake's presence has been beneficial rather than harmful. David's face flushed red. Your Honor, surely you're not basing a custody decision on children's testimony. I'm basing it on comprehensive evidence that includes children's perspectives, yes. These children have demonstrated more wisdom about family than many adults show in years of litigation. She looked at her notes, then back at the room. Custody remains with Ms. Chen. Mr. Harrison, your visitation rights are unchanged. This court finds no evidence that Sophie's welfare has been compromised. As the hearing concluded, Alexandra found herself face to face with Connor for the first time since their heartbreaking goodbye. I don't understand, Alexandra said. How did you... Grace did this, Connor said softly. She spent weeks drawing pictures of what she wanted to say, then asked me to help her find someone who would listen to children instead of just adults. His eyes met hers. She said you were sad because you thought you had to choose between Sophie and us. But she wanted everyone to understand that love doesn't make people choose. It makes them stronger. Alexandra felt tears streaming down her face. Connor, I'm so sorry. I was terrified of losing Sophie, but I couldn't see. You were protecting your daughter. Connor interrupted gently. But the question now is, what do you want to do moving forward? Sophie and Grace appeared beside them, holding hands. Can we go home now? Sophie asked. All of us together like we used to. Alexandra looked at Connor, at Grace, at Sophie, at these three people who had somehow become her whole world despite her best efforts to protect herself from exactly this kind of vulnerability. Yes, she whispered. Let's go home. 1 year later, the same courthouse hosted a very different ceremony. Alexandra wore a simple ivory dress and carried wildflowers. Connor stood waiting in a suit that actually fit his eyes, bright with joy that hadn't dimmed since the custody hearing. Grace was the flower girl, walking carefully, while Sophie served as maid of honor, both girls beaming with pride. Judge Patterson officiated with obvious pleasure. I've never seen a family fight harder to stay together, she said during the reception, or been happier to witness love triumph over fear. Their first dance was to a song Grace had chosen about finding your way home. As they swayed together, Alexandra spotted Sophie and Grace in the corner, building something elaborate with blocks. What do you think they're constructing? Connor asked. Our future, Alexandra replied, watching their daughters create something beautiful together, one piece at a time. Years later, their story became more than personal happiness. Chen Blake Technologies launched the largest accessibility initiative in tech history. Grace, now speaking confidently, served as youth ambassador. Sophie helped design the program that provided technology training for children with communication challenges. Sometimes love doesn't look like fairy tales. Sometimes it looks like a billionaire standing up to a bully, a child finding her voice, a family choosing each other repeatedly until choosing becomes unbreakable habit. When you're brave enough to do something unbelievable, love does something unbelievable right back. It transforms not just hearts, but entire communities, proving that the greatest wealth isn't measured in money, but in people willing to stand with you when the world demands you choose between safety and love. And sometimes, if you're incredibly fortunate, you discover you don't have to choose at all. Friends, if this story touched your heart the way it touched mine, if it reminded you that second chances exist, that broken doesn't mean beyond repair, that sometimes all someone needs is to be seen, please don't let it end here. Hit that subscribe button and join our family, where every story lifts the spirit and reminds us that light always finds its way back. Share this story with someone who needs to remember that kindness still matters, that compassion still changes lives, and that hope is never wasted. And if you believe in the power of standing up for what's right, especially when it requires courage instead of just good intentions, drop a heart in the comments below. Your support helps us bring more stories like this to people who need to believe that love always wins in the end, even when the path seems impossible. Thanks for watching, and remember, you never know when one moment of courage might change everything.